Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking, and great to have you along for another episode of Classic Fights. This is where we go back in time and look at, as the title says, the classic fight from years ago, and analyse it and just see about what made that fight actually such a great event back in the day. So I'm going to bring in my co-host now. I've spat all that out. It's the one and only Peter Maniatis. How are we, Pete?
No, good to be on the show, Lyndon. I'm sure it's a classic fight night tonight. It's one of my favourites.
Yeah, well, I must admit, mate, I'd always heard about this fight, but I'd never actually sat down and watched it. I obviously knew all about Paul Ferreri being an Aussie, and this is obviously mainly for our Aussie fans out there, but I'm sure there's a lot of international fans out there that remember, obviously, Carlos Zarate and how good he was. But to actually sit down for the first time and watch this fight, it was a really good fight. And I know at the end of the day, Paul was overmatched by a truly great fighter, but I was just amazed at how much heart and tickle that he actually showed in the fight.
Yeah, what a terrific fight. And at the time, Carlos Zarate was indestructible. He was one of the pound-for-pound kings. He was a Mexican legend. And fighters weren't going past 2 or 3 rounds. We're talking about world-class fighters, because back then it was just the WBC and WBA. There was no IBF. So you're talking about a guy that had both titles at the time that basically had to fight him to become, the champion of the world. And he was knocking guys out left, right, and centre. So,
there's no skirting around it back then, was there, as far as getting the cheap titles? And credit to Paul Ferreri. And actually, before we get into it, I may as well obviously announce the fight that we're actually doing. It's, of course, Carlos Zarate and Australia's Paul Ferreri. Pete, I'm really glad I spelt Ferrari right, because initially I had it wrong. I had it spelt like the car, but I knew you'd pick me up on it, so I spelt checked it, and there it is, Paul Ferrari. Is that how you pronounce it, Paul Ferrari, or is it Ferreri?
No, Ferrari.
Ferrari, okay. So you can see there, it's the WBC Bantamweight Championship. Inglewood Forum, the famous forum in Inglewood, California, took place on August 28th, 1976. So tell us about it, Pete. I mean, you obviously picked this fight. And as I said, I knew about the fight, but I'd never actually watched it. You were actually pretty close to Paul. Tell me some background about the fight.
Yeah, well, Lionel Rose fought on the undercard. He fought Bazooka Lamont, and Paul and Lionel travelled over there and with Jack Rennie. Paul at the time got paid $45,000 in 1976. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
And went live back to Australia. Ron Casey went over to cover the fight, so Ron Casey was involved. And it was massive. There was a guy that actually used to do all the customs in Australia, and he used to shoe the VIPs in. And when Paul came back, even though Paul never won, he made sure Paul got the VIP treatment where the celebrities get you whisking through customs. So he made it a big deal because of the effort Paul put in. You've got to remember, Carlos Zarate back then was just bowling them out over like flies. And we're talking 2-3 rounds. He was 43 and zip, I think with 41 KOs.
Yep.
41 KOs. And we've got WBA and WBC back then, nowhere to hide. There was no other organisations. It was just those two, and you had to go through Zarate. And look, Paul defeated a guy called Rolando Neveretti, who made 5 or 6 WBC world title defences, based in Hawaii. Crazy guy. They used to call him a hoodlum of De Gaius. He's from where Manny Pacquiao was. Manny used to idolise him growing up. He's a street guy. I met him a few times. He's a real knockabout guy. I mean, if you see him, he looks like Charles Bronson. And there's a funny story. He got charged with rape in Hawaii. And President Marcos, Philippines, they'd done a deal where, bang, he went straight back to the Philippines. And Bruce McTavish was the referee. It was his comeback fight, live everywhere. He got a pardon. And he's just such a crazy guy. And Bruce said he knocked the guy down, and when the guy was on the canvas, Carlos Zarate spat on him. And he was just about to kick him. So Bruce had to push him aside because this guy's just been pardoned by President Marcos. Whole of Philippines is watching. McTavish don't want to DQ him. He probably won't get home.
Yeah.
So Bruce just said, please settle down. So they're trying to, obviously we're talking about a wild man. Well, Paul Ferreri travelled to Cebu and he defeated Rolando Neveretti on points at his peak.
Yeah.
So that's how good Paul was. But getting back to the Carlos Zarate story, Paul told me he travelled there well. He felt Carlos Zarate never made the weight. He said they dodged the scales on him. And Paul said he made the weight very comfortably, but he feels Zarate never made the weight.
How did they dodge it? Was the old Jeff Fennick trick where they lift him up while they have 100?
And then Paul went nuts on Jack Rennie and said, Jack, you didn't get him back on. And Jack said, just settle down, Paul. Because Paul's a real kind of level-headed plastic guy, but when he lost his temper, he was a hothead.
Yeah.
So Paul's lost his temper, said, get him back on. And he said, no, mate, he's made the weight. We're going to leave it at that. Paul goes, mate, get him back on. I want to see it again. And Jack didn't want to sort of rock the boat. Yeah. Richard Steele was a referee.
Yeah, very young Richard Steele.
And Paul felt that he told me that he was feeling, because Zarate was knocking everyone out, and he was feeling that he was getting right into the fight as the fight was going. And back then it was 15 rounds.
Yeah.
And Paul said after the fight, Carlos Zarate actually collapsed in his change rooms, and they had to basically get an ambulance. So he was dehydrated and collapsed.
Well, it was a hot night,
what would have happened if what would have happened if the other 3 rounds happened and he collapses in the ring?
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
Yeah, it was.
Whether he would have or he wouldn't, I don't know. But Paul always felt cheated that he lost that opportunity.
Well, it would have been such a hostile environment because obviously he was the opponent. Zarate, as you said, was 43-0 or 42-0, whatever it was, with 41 knockouts. I mean, he was just knocking everyone out. Paul Ferreri had a 50 wins, 3 losses, 5 draws, but only 9 knockouts at the time. So he's coming up against an absolute beast. And to go over there, as I said, he was the opponent, the Inglewood Forum, full of Mexicans. You know, he was definitely the B side. Wasn't supposed to win. Would have been pretty daunting to even raise that at the weigh-in about weighing in again, because it was never going to happen.
Yeah, that was a big issue. Paul never, whenever we relaxed and we spoke about it, he would have brought it up. I mean, I've known Paul for a very long time. I reckon, without exaggeration, he would have brought it up 25 times. And he had a funny story about the Rocky Mattioli fight as well, but I won't go into that. But
Rocky Gattalari?
Yeah, well, they fought at the Horton Pavilion.
Yeah.
And it went 4 rounds, but the 5th round actually happened in the showers at the back of the Horton Pavilion. And that Anton Sebsek knows it as well. But that probably the best of that contest happened at the back, and Paul won that as well.
Well, it really was the glory days back then, wasn't it? Especially like in the States with Carlos Zarate was probably one of the first real Mexican heroes back then, wasn't he? And as I said, it would have been so daunting to be in that arena with probably what would have been 15 or 20,000 Mexican fans. And I've actually been to the Inglewood Forum. I think I saw Chocolatito and Estrada. I think the second fight. I think it was one of them anyway. It was a Chocolatito fight, and it was against a Mexican. It was such an amazing atmosphere, and just the stadium itself. It was really old, but it was just it had that aura about it of so many wars that had been fought there in the past. So I could just imagine what Paul Ferreri was going through. And I think you mentioned Jack Rennie. Pete, was he Paul's trainer? We obviously know he was Lionel Rose's trainer, so he doubled up on the night with both of them.
Yeah, he was Paul's trainer. He went everywhere with Paul, and he was Paul's trainer and manager. So, because back then your trainer was your manager, it was old school.
Yeah.
And Jack wouldn't drink. He said Jack would drink 2 litres of Coca-Cola. He was that type of bloke, and have an ice cream and all that stuff. And Paul enjoyed a beer after the fight, but Jack would never drink. But Paul would never touch anything, no alcohol or women and all that. He was old school before the fight.
How did they go on the night with that in mind then, with Lionel Rose being on the undercard, because he was the main support? Did they put a quick fight in between them, or he was actually on straight after the with Ferrari?
No, I think it was straight after with a break.
Jeez, talk about that.
Jack had it.
I was just going to say, talk about putting some more obstacles in front of the team anyway.
And back then, we're talking about the whole Australia watching. It wasn't like, that was live on Channel 7 with Ron Casey over there. It's like now Bruce McAvaney live, and we're coming back from Tokyo and Canelo, and the whole Australia's watching. That was the atmosphere back then. Wow. And Lionel on the undercard. So it was massive. And you had Wild World of Sports and things like that back then. And Paul would always be on Wild World of Sports once or twice a week leading up to the fight with who used to do? Gus Mercurio used to do the boxing section back then.
He did.
Good old Gus, yeah.
It was the definitely the golden age, as I said, not just in the States but over here as well. We're coming off such a wave of success. So as you said, Pete, it was for the it was 42 or 43 or whatever it was, and with 41 KOs. Ferrari 50 wins, 3 losses, 5 draws, and only 9 KOs. Zarate had won the title that year before, I think it was, or the same year I think it was, with a 9th round KO. Of Rodolfo Martinez, a fellow Mexican. So he was making his first defence, where this was Paul Ferrari's first fight in the States. So, yeah, talk about a baptism of fire. Let's get the video going as we talk more about it. This is here it is. Here you can tell this is the day before the times before digital TV and media streaming and all the rest of it. Pete, it's pretty basic, prehistoric type of TV, isn't it?
Yeah, and Jack Rennie, a young Jack there talking to Paul. And Paul started with Ambrose Palmer. He had his first couple of pro fights with Ambrose Palmer during the TV ringside days. Paul didn't have any amateur fights. He only had a couple of, I don't think he had one amateur fight. He didn't have one because Ambrose said you might as well get paid for it.
Yep.
So Paul used to turn up with his bags at Festival Hall TV ringside waiting for a late pullout, and he'd jump in. It was just one of those guys, Paul. Had gloves, will travel. Commonwealth champion for 15 years, 3 different weight classes too.
And back then was when the Commonwealth title actually meant a lot back then, didn't it? These days it's almost sort of thrown into the regional title sort of category, but back then it was a massive thing to win the Commonwealth title, wasn't it?
Oh, it was huge. It was second to a world title, and Paul held that for 15 years. So you could see, we're talking about a real world-class fighter, and he's fought in Italy, based himself in Italy, and very technical. He said to me he felt he gave Carlos a lot more respect than he should have in this fight, but he obviously would have been overawed just with the whole big picture of going to America and his first big step up on that stage.
Well, you can see there, one thing that's glaring there is the size difference, and even though you said that Carlos Zarate might not have made the weight, it would have been pretty similar, but you can see the size there, and just imagine being in the ring with Zarate. He just hunts them down, doesn't he? Like a lot of Mexican fighters did, but that's one thing that watching the fight was that stuck out, was at how small Paul Ferrari actually looked in comparison to Zarate. Yeah,
and a young Richard Steele there. He went on to referee so many great fights himself, Richard Steele. But yeah, Paul, for mine, he was one of the unluckiest fighters not to win a world title. Back then, if we had IBF and WBO, he could have won world titles in multiple weight classes. I don't say that lightly either. You go through his record, he just defeated some great fighters. And started with a great Ambrose Palmer and then moved to Jack Rennie. And he told me he moved to Jack Rennie because back then Jack Rennie had all international contacts. Because you got to remember, in the 60s and 70s, the world was so much bigger than what it is now. Now we've got the internet, the world's so much smaller. And back then it was a massive big world, and the only one that had the international contacts was Jack. So every fighter would go to Jack and he'd get them fights overseas as well. So Paul went with Jack, and obviously he got his world title shot and got a few other shots as well. But during this fight, for mine, Paul was probably giving Zarate a bit too much respect. I think Paul could have let his hands go a bit more, but saying that when you've got a murderous puncher with that type of reputation, it's easy for us saying that while I'm sitting on my cushion chair and not getting punched in the nose. But I still felt that he was very competitive in every round.
Yeah, watching it when I did the edit here, I actually gave Paul Ferrari the first round. Zarate didn't really throw a punch. You could see he was sizing him up, but I actually thought he threw some really nice punches. Even right throughout the fight, he threw some really good punches. The problem is that Zarate looks like one of those fighters. If you try and box him from long distance, he's got that height and reach that he's gonna hunt you down anyway. And if you try and fight him on the inside, like all Mexican fighters are, they can just rip and hook and uppercut like no other fighters can. And so really, there wasn't probably a lot he could do in hindsight. I mean, he showed so much heart, but I think he fought a great fight. But unfortunately, we can break it down. But he was just sort of outmatched on the night. But you are right. He probably did give him a little bit of respect, but. Geez, if anyone earned respect up to that point, it was Carlos Zarate.
I mean, look at the size of his shoulders and arms, and you can just tell he's a heavy hitter. You can see that his punches are loaded. You don't want to. I mean, Jeff Fennick fought Carlos Zarate too. Fennick said he was a nightmare to fight, and that imagine fighting him at his peak in front of 15, 20,000 Mexicans. It's not a walk in the park, is it? Let's be honest.
No, that's right. It's one thing fighting a 36 or 37-year-old or whatever he was at the time in Sydney, to fighting a 26 or 27-year-old in prime Zarate at the Inglewood Forum. So, mate, as we just said before, it's easy to say you should have done this or should have done that. But at the end of the day, mate, I can just imagine, the atmosphere and the conditions he was under, especially with the heat as well. And I can do nothing but take my hat off to him as far as the heart he showed in this fight.
Oh, for sure. Look, I think Jeff Fennick, if you had to put Jeff Fennick in against Carlos Zarate, I think Jeff Fennick beats Carlos Zarate because Fennick was such a freak. Yep. I think he would have found a way to win.
At bantamweight,
especially, at bantamweight. I think Jeff would have found a way to win because his hands weren't as banged up at bantamweight. I think he would have found a way to beat Carlos Zarate, but it would have been a tough fight for anyone in that circumstance, because Zarate goes down as one of the great Mexican fighters, and for Paul to be in there, hot night, and really go 12 rounds before Richards, I won't give it away what happened, but now they're looking at the cut, so Paul's cut, and it's just one of those situations where, obviously, a bigger, stronger guy. You could just see Zarate was a bit bigger and stronger than Paul.
That's right. And the thing is, too, I said before about his knockout ratio, he'd never gone more than 10 rounds, Carlos Zarate. He'd won a 10-round decision along the way. But apart from that, I think the furthest he's gone was when he won the title with that 9th-round KO of Rodolfo Martinez. So to think that Paul Ferreri's gone 12 rounds and actually been stopped on a cut, of all things, I mean, who knows, maybe... Look, as you said earlier, with Zarate struggling with the heat, who knows? He could have, Zarate could have got him out of there, or Paul Ferreri could have full well gone to 15 rounds, or Zarate might have collapsed beforehand. There's a lot of unknowns, but at the end of the day, he went 12 rounds and was stopped on a cut. So it's just a monumental achievement, I think.
Oh, amazing achievement, and one of the fights we don't talk too much about because
we don't.
Obviously it slipped the radar.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that too, mate. That we've discussed it on this show or other shows in the past about some of the great Australian efforts. Now, even though Paul Ferreri didn't get the win here, I mean, to fight Zarate, as we said before, it'd be like Tim Tszyu going over to fight Canelo Alvarez. That's what it would be like, and that's in his hometown. So to go over there and do what he did, I think it's, even though he was out of his depth at the end, I think the fact that he went over there and did what he did, it's got a rate as far as one of our better performances by an Australian boxer, even though he didn't get the win.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, to get stopped on cuts, he was never on the ground. He never got dropped.
No, he never got dropped.
He never really got hurt.
No.
Too bad. I don't know if they had adrenaline back then or if that was seen, but they just couldn't get the cuts under control. And Richard Steele's always been known to stop fights like that and stop them early. Yeah,
he has. Well, I was just going to say, Pete, you can see, I think it's in this round here, you can actually see, a fair bit of glob or something hanging off Paul Ferreri's eye. So I don't know whether it was a big glob of Vaseline or what they tried to do, but at the end of it, you could barely see. And I think he opened up a cut on the left eye as well in this round as well. So really, you can see there. So
it's like really, a Band-Aid or something.
Yeah, it looks like it, doesn't it? I'm not sure they would have been able to put it on, but it definitely looks like one. But either way, look, I think Richard Steele in this aspect actually did the right thing. I thought there was, Paul was really starting to slow down. He was cut over both eyes. Zarate was really starting to power up. So I've got to say, I actually agree with the stoppage here. What did you think?
Yeah, look, I would have probably given him a round or two more, but only because, Paul would have enjoyed that round or two more, mate. He was a competitor. It's no different to the tennis. I mean, if we were watching the tennis the other night, you would have stopped it midway through the third round and said to Rafa, get in the change rooms, mate. It's not your night tonight.
Yeah, no,
but
you're right.
You just never know.
And especially in a sport like boxing where you just never know. I suppose the only thing going against him was the fact that he wasn't a knockout puncher. But as you said before, Zarate apparently collapsed in the change room. So who knows what would have happened. So you said before, after the fight, Pete, what was Paul's sort of thoughts immediately after? You said he felt a little bit sort of hard done by. Was he happy with his performance, or was it a case of what could have been?
Oh, he thought he was, between you and I, he kept saying, well, I thought I was going to get paid more than 45k. So he went straight to Jack and said, mate, I thought I was getting more than 45 was a big. I tried to explain that to the person. 45 now's a good fight. In 76, Paul, you could have bought a house in Brighton.
That's right.
But don't think it.
Yeah, it's probably a $400,000 or $500,000 equivalent, isn't it? Really?
Or more in 76. The average wage would have been $100. Yeah. I reckon $80 to $100. Wow. I mean, the Herald Sun would have been 5 cents. Yeah. So, look, he sort of went down, and it started to sink in that he lost, and he's going to go back to normal because he had high hopes he was going to win the fight, and as all fighters do, and Jack just said to him, "Don't worry, we'll recoup." He remembers saying Jack was positive because Lionel got beat as well, and they both sort of got beat, and they were both in a hotel, and they were both having a drink after the fight. Lionel was just basically saying, "Mate, just don't worry, we'll regroup, we'll get back home." He was just trying to keep it positive, and he said, "Oh, I'm talking to Ron Casey, blah blah," because Ron Casey had a lot to do with stuff back then, as far as because he had Channel 7 on TV. Yeah, and he said, "Look, we'll talk to Ron and blah 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 and all this stuff." But Paul just felt that he missed his opportunity, and the fight should never have been stopped. And he was upset that he found out that Zarate had collapsed in the change rooms after the fight, and it would have changed his life if he had won that fight.
Oh, for sure. Well, unfortunately, ended up being his only opportunity at a world title. He ended up having, strangely enough, another 38 fights after that. He went 29-9 after that. Obviously, he fought for a lot of Commonwealth titles and Australian titles that he sort of won and lost along the way. He's probably majored 2 fights after that were against Rocky Gadolari, as you said before. I think I've got on BoxRec it said it was a 3rd round stoppage, but I think you might have said it's 4th either way. And then he had
a 3rd or 4th,
a memorable fight with Tony Mad Dog Miller, where he lost a close 12-round decision back in 1986. So, and Tony Miller at that time was a really up-and-coming young gun, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think Paul was 39 or 40 at the time. Yeah. And back then in the mid-80s, 40 was like 60 now. Yeah. Fighters, they used to say, give it up when you got to 30. So Paul, I remember, no, they did, you're 30 now, mate, you're thinking of retiring. In the 80s, that's, if you got to 30 plus 30, it was a good career. And Paul getting close to 40 and still fighting, he became one of those the first of the evergreen type of fighters. And, he was wrapped in that fight with Tony Miller. He said, I was wrapped with the way I went for my age, and I thought I won the fight. But he goes, I understand why they gave it to Tony. I'm the old bloke. He's a prospect. Why ruin him? I'm on my way out. Give it, he understood the chemistry of it.
Yeah, well, he ended up retiring after that in 1986. He finished with a 78 wins, 13 loss, 5 draws with 26 KO record. And I looked at looking at his record. He fought in obviously America, South Korea, South Africa, Italy, the Philippines, England, Denmark, and that's to name a few. There's probably another 3 or 4 countries outside that. So he was really the
Bahamas.
Yeah, I've got that there. Yeah, so yeah, it was just an amazing career, and I must admit I'm guilty of probably not having Paul Ferreri as maybe as high up on our Australian list as what maybe he deserved, because I know in one of our first episodes we did the Australian top 10, and I never really even had him in consideration. And having looked at his record and obviously this fight, I think he definitely deserves to be in the mix of that sort of 10 to 15 mark anyway.
He was a proud Western Suburbs man as well, and he trained Lester Ellis for Leicester's first 4 or 5 professional bouts. I didn't know that. And he trained Lester during all his amateur bouts. Yep. And they used to spar. They said when Lester was 16, 17, him and Paul would get in at Paul's Avondale Heights backyard at gym and spar, and he'd bring Lester along. And I think after about the 5th professional fight, Lester went on. But Paul had him in the amateurs and the pros. So Paul's been involved. He was a real proud Western Suburbs bloke, and not only a good fighter, also a trainer.
Yeah, and he was involved in the amateur scene for a while after that as well. As for Carlos Zarate, well, that was really the start for him. Well, I say the start, he had 40-odd fights by that stage. We ended up having another 7 successful defences after that, so a total of 8 in total. They ended up losing to Wilfredo Gomez in what would have been a massive fight back in the day for the WBC Super Bantamweight Title. That was in 1978. And ended up losing to another compatriot when he lost a 12-round decision to Lupi Pintor in 1979 for the WBC Bantamweight title. Retired after that in 1986. In 1979 that was. Came back in 1986, as we know. We mentioned he fought Jeff. Came back and actually compiled a record of 12-0 with 10 KOs, by the way, if you don't mind, before he got the shot at Jeff Fenech for the WBC Super Bantamweight title. Ended in controversy. I actually thought he put up a really good fight until the accidental head clash gave Jeff a cut under the eye. And I still dispute to this day. I got no doubt Jeff would have won, but the cut was under the eye. I don't know how they would stop a fight that's actually got a cut under the eye, but they did back in the day. Jeff got the benefit of the doubt. As I said, I think it was only a matter of time before Jeff got him, but strange enough, then fought another Jeff Fenech victim in Daniel Zaragoza for the WBC Super Bantamweight title in 1988. Lost a disputed 12-round decision and ended up retiring with a 66-win, 4-loss with 63 KO record. That is just unbelievable.
No, not a bad career. And yet, look, Jeff Fenech is just a living legend, really. Yeah. And for Zarate, I think Jeff beat Zarate 10 times out of 10 times, in my opinion.
Yeah.
If they ever fought.
Well, Jeff had that style.
Yeah, I thought Jeff was winning that fight easy with Zarate, but Jeff probably maybe would have stopped him later in the fight anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I think Jeff definitely would have won and probably would have got him out of there. I think probably 8, 9, 10 rounds. But as I said, I thought it was strange that it was a cut under the eye, and it wasn't. Well, probably Jeff would be the best one to answer this, but it looked more like a graze or a scratch rather than a cut. So, as I said, I'm not sure whether you get a cut under the eye these days, they'd stop it, because I've seen fights with big cuts straight down the middle that are about a centimetre wide and they've let go. So, anyway, I suppose maybe we've mellowed in our old age with boxing. They let a lot more go than what they used to. But look, I suppose the underlining thing of all this is that this particular fight, very, very underrated. If you haven't watched the fight in full, make sure you check it out. That's just not Aussie fight fans. If you're a Zarate fan or just a boxing fan in general, check it out, because it was a really clinical performance by Zarate, but a really underrated performance by Australian, Paul Ferreri, and obviously Zarate went on to be a living legend in the boxing world, and Paul Ferreri, as I said before, really cemented his spot more so for me in my standings of Australian boxers. So yeah, hats off to Paul Ferreri, because as I said during the vision, I can only imagine what he went through and his team went through fighting Zarate at the Inglewood Forum back in the day. It would have been crazy.
Yeah, it would have been an amazing atmosphere. And Paul was inducted in the Australian Boxing Hall of Fame as well. So, he's a Hall of Famer and a great guy and a great champion.
Great stuff, mate. Well, really good decision there with this week's fight. It's actually back to me next week, and I'm going to go back to the international side of things. We've done a few Australian fights lately, but I'm going to go for the first fight between Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello back in the day. We might even make it the duo, I think, like we did a few weeks back with Rafael Marquez and Israel Vasquez. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but I think, Alexis Arguello versus Aaron Pryor, again, definitions of classic fight. So we'll cover them next week. Hopefully we'll have Tassie back, maybe even Mike. We'll see how we're going. But if not, mate, it'll be me and you again. So thanks again. Great pick with this one. And as I said, check it out if you haven't seen it before. So thanks, mate. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Linda.